The autumn wind carried the sting of ridicule as Fiona Lawson hurried down the main street of Cottonwood Creek, clutching her threadbare shawl tightly around her shoulders. It wasn't just the wind that made her shiver, it was the sneers and whispers that followed her like faithful shadows. "There goes the pauper princess," called Judith Mercer from the doorway of her father's general store. "Still wearing your mother's old rags, I see." Fiona kept her head high, though her cheeks burned with humiliation. At 22, she had grown accustomed to the taunts but never immune to them. 3 years after her parents' deaths from fever, she was struggling to maintain the small homestead they'd left behind, selling eggs and whatever vegetables her modest garden produced. "Don't waste your breath on her, Judith," Thomas Holloway added with a cruel laugh. "She ain't got 2 pennies to rub together." Their laughter pierced her like arrows as she quickened her pace. She needed to deliver her last dozen eggs to Mrs. Wilson at the boarding house and get home before dark. The early October chill of 1877 was settling into the Montana territory, promising a harsh winter ahead one Fiona wasn't sure she could survive. She was so focused on the rutted road ahead that she didn't notice the commotion at the livery, until she nearly collided with a magnificent chestnut horse. Startled, she stumbled backward, dropping her basket of eggs. They shattered on impact, yolks spreading like liquid gold across the dirt. "No!" The cry escaped her lips before she could stop it. Those eggs represented her meals for the week, or the lamp oil she desperately needed. "Whoa there, easy," came a deep voice as strong hands steadied her shoulders. "That's quite a mess I've caused." Fiona looked up into the face of a stranger, tall and broad-shouldered with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of a summer storm. His clothes were dusty from the trail, but even she could tell they were of fine quality. The silver conchos on his leather vest gleamed in the late afternoon sun. "I'm so sorry, madam." He removed his hat, revealing dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. "Seems my horse and I weren't watching where we were heading." "It's not your fault," Fiona said quickly, though her heart sank as she stared at the ruined eggs. "I wasn't paying attention either." The small crowd that had gathered to welcome the newcomer now turned their attention to Fiona's predicament, their amusement evident. "There goes her supper for the week," someone muttered, followed by ill-concealed laughter. The stranger's expression hardened as he glanced at the onlookers, then back to Fiona. Without hesitation, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a gold coin, pressing it into her palm. "This should cover the eggs and then some," he said, his voice carrying clearly to the watching townsfolk. "And anything else you might need." Fiona stared at the coin in shock. It was more money than she'd seen in months. "Sir, I can't possibly." "Name's Hayes Young," he interrupted with a smile that transformed his rugged features. "Just arrived from Denver, and you are?" "Fiona Lawson," she replied, still stunned by his generosity. Something flickered in his eyes, recognition, perhaps, though she was certain they'd never met. He turned to address the now silent crowd, his voice ringing with authority. "Miss Lawson, I insist you let me make proper amends." "Everything she wants," he announced, looking pointedly at the sneering faces around them, "I'll get." The declaration hung in the air, silencing even the most persistent whispers. Fiona felt her face grow hot with a mixture of embarrassment and something else she couldn't quite name. This handsome stranger had just publicly defended her honor in a town that had long ago decided she wasn't worth the effort. "That's very kind, Mr. Young, but Hayes," he corrected gently, "and I won't hear any arguments. Now, how about I walk you home? My horse could use the exercise after the long ride, and I'd welcome the chance to learn about Cottonwood Creek from someone who lives here." Before she could protest further, he gathered the remains of her basket and offered his arm. The gesture was so foreign to her that she hesitated, aware of the staring eyes of the townspeople. "Don't mind them," Hayes said quietly. "Some folks have nothing better to do than pass judgment on others. I never put much stock in that sort." With a deep breath, Fiona placed her hand on his offered arm. The solid warmth of him was reassuring in a way she hadn't felt since her father's passing. My place is about a mile outside town, she warned. You don't have to perfect. I could use the walk after 2 days in the saddle. He clicked his tongue, and the chestnut horse fell into step beside them. As they left the town behind, Fiona couldn't help but wonder what had brought this man to their small corner of Montana, and why he'd shown such unexpected kindness to someone like her. You're probably wondering why I've come to Cottonwood Creek, Hayes said, as if reading her thoughts. Fiona nodded, careful to avoid the muddier patches of the road. We don't get many visitors, especially this late in the season. Hayes was silent for a moment, as if considering his words carefully. I'm looking for land, good grazing land for cattle. I've heard the valleys around here have promise. There's plenty of open country, Fiona agreed, though winters are harsh. I don't mind harsh conditions. Something in his tone suggested he wasn't just talking about the weather. What about you, Miss Lawson? Have you always lived here? The question was innocent enough, but Fiona felt a familiar pang. My parents came here when I was 12. They had dreams of building a prosperous farm, but... She trailed off, not wanting to burden this stranger with her troubles. But life had other plans. Hayes finished for her, his voice gentle. Yes, she was grateful for his understanding. They both died 3 years ago. Fever took them within days of each other. Hayes stopped walking, turning to face her fully. And you've been managing alone since then? The concern in his eyes was so genuine that Fiona had to look away. I get by. From what I heard back in town, it seems you do more than just get by. You survive despite their best efforts to see you fail. His perception startled her. Few people had ever looked beyond her circumstances to see the daily battle she fought. It's my home, she said simply. I won't let them drive me from it. A smile of admiration curved his lips. That's courage, Miss Lawson. They resumed walking, and soon the small homestead came into view. Fiona felt a familiar mixture of pride and shame as Hayes took in the modest cabin with its weathered logs and patched roof. The barn leaned slightly, and the corral fence needed mending, but the place was clean and well kept despite its obvious state of disrepair. It's not much, she said quickly, but the land is good. The creek never runs dry, even in drought years. Hayes studied the property with an expression she couldn't read. You've done remarkably well on your own. His words contained no pity, only respect, and Fiona felt herself stand a little straighter. Thank you for walking me home, Mr. Young Hayes, she corrected herself. And for the coin. It's far too much for some broken eggs, but I'm grateful, he shook his head. I meant what I said in town. Whatever you need, I'm happy to help. I'll be staying at the boarding house while I look at properties. Perhaps I could call on you tomorrow. The invitation was so unexpected that Fiona blinked in surprise. Call on me, whatever for, Hayes laughed, a rich sound that seemed to warm the cooling air around them. To continue our conversation, of course, and perhaps to discuss some business. Business, she echoed. I'm in need of someone who knows this area, the people, the land. Someone honest. His eyes held hers. Would you consider helping me, Miss Lawson? Fiona hesitated. The gold coin in her pocket felt heavy with possibility, but experience had taught her to be wary of unexpected generosity. I'm not sure what help I could be, but you're welcome to visit, she finally replied. Excellent. Until tomorrow, then. Hayes tipped his hat and mounted his horse with fluid grace. Good evening, Miss Lawson. As he rode away, Fiona stood motionless, watching until horse and rider disappeared around the bend. She couldn't shake the feeling that her life had somehow shifted in the space of an hour all, because a handsome stranger had paid for some broken eggs and made a declaration that still echoed in her mind. Everything she wants, I'll get. The words followed her into the cabin, where she lit her last candle and placed the gold coin on the table, wondering what tomorrow might bring. Dawn arrived with a clarity that only comes after the first frost. Fiona rose early, as was her habit, to tend to her few animals. The 2 milk cows, Bella and Daisy, greeted her with soft moos. Her old mare, Penny, nickered from her stall. The chickens clucked impatiently, eager for their morning feed. The routine was comforting, but today, Fiona moved through her chores with an unusual sense of anticipation. She told herself, it was simply the promise of the gold coin and what it could buy: flour, sugar, coffee, maybe even fabric for a new dress. But the image of storm gray eyes and a smile that seemed to see beyond her circumstances kept intruding on her practical thoughts. After milking the cows, she washed her face and hands in cold water from the pump and changed into her best dress, a faded blue calico that had once belonged to her mother. She brushed her light brown hair until it shone and twisted it into a simple knot at the nape of her neck. "Don't be foolish," she scolded her reflection in the small mirror over the washstand. "He's just being kind, or he wants something from the land. Either way, it's not about you." Still, she couldn't help the flutter in her stomach when, shortly after midday, the sound of hoofbeats announced Hayes Young's arrival. She stepped onto the porch, shading her eyes against the bright autumn sun. He rode up to the hitching post and dismounted in one fluid motion, looking even more handsome in the daylight. He'd clearly bathed and changed since yesterday. His dark hair was neatly combed, and his clothes were fresh: a blue shirt under a leather vest, dark trousers, and polished boots. "Good afternoon, Miss Lawson," he called, tipping his hat. "I hope I'm not interrupting your day." "Not at all," she replied, suddenly conscious of her worn dress and work-roughened hands. "Would you like some coffee? It's fresh." "That would be wonderful." He secured his horse and strode toward the porch, carrying a parcel wrapped in brown paper. "I took the liberty of bringing a few things from town." He handed her the package with a smile that made her heart skip. Fiona accepted it with hesitation. "You didn't need to bring anything." "Please, it's just a small token." His eyes were warm with genuine kindness. Inside the cabin, Fiona busied herself with pouring coffee while Hayes looked around the modest space. Though simple, the room was neat and clean. Faded curtains hung at the windows, and a patchwork quilt brightened the rocking chair by the hearth. "This is a fine place," he said, accepting the mug she offered. "You've made it a real home." Fiona felt a rush of pride at his words. "It was my parents' dream. They worked so hard to build it. And you've honored that by keeping it going." Hayes sat at the small table, gesturing for her to join him. "That takes remarkable strength." Fiona sat across from him, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of her mug. "You mentioned business yesterday. What sort of help were you looking for?" Hayes took a sip of coffee before answering. "I'm looking to establish a cattle operation. I've got funds from some successful ventures in Colorado, but I need land, good land with water access and grazing potential. And I need someone who knows which properties might be available, which sellers are honest, and which are looking to take advantage of an outsider." "And you think I can help with that?" Fiona asked, surprised. "I do." His gaze was direct. "You strike me as someone who sees things clearly without pretense. That's rare and valuable." Fiona considered his words. She did know the area well, and after 3 years of struggling alone, she'd learned which townspeople could be trusted and which couldn't. Still, she was wary. "Why me? There are others in town with more connections. Mr. Perkins at the bank or Sheriff Davis." Hayes's expression darkened slightly. "I've met both gentlemen. They seem invested in the status quo. I prefer to form my own opinions about people and opportunities." Fiona couldn't argue with his assessment. Both men had been less than helpful when she'd struggled to keep the farm after her parents died. "What exactly would this arrangement involve?" she asked. "I'd pay you a fair wage to accompany me as I look at properties, to share your knowledge of the land and the people. Say $2 a day." Fiona nearly choked on her coffee. $2 was more than she sometimes earned in a week. "That's far too generous," she protested. "It's the going rate for a knowledgeable guide," he countered smoothly. "I don't believe in underpaying for valuable services." Before she could respond, he gestured to the package she'd set aside. "Aren't you going to open it?" With slightly trembling fingers, Fiona unwrapped the parcel. Inside were basic supplies: flour, sugar, coffee beans. salt but also a bar of lavender-scented soap, a small bottle of rosewater, and a length of rich blue fabric that shimmered in the light from the window. "Mr. Young," she began, her voice faltering. "Hayes," he reminded her gently. "And before you protest, remember my words in town. I intend to keep that promise." Fiona touched the fabric with reverent fingers. It had been so long since she'd owned anything beautiful. "I don't understand why you're doing this." Hayes set down his mug, his expression turning serious. "Because I know what it's like to have nothing, Miss Lawson, to be judged for circumstances beyond your control." Something in his tone told Fiona he wasn't merely offering platitudes. "You do," he nodded, his eyes distant with memory. "I wasn't always in a position to help others. There was a time when I was the one in need." He seemed about to say more, then visibly redirected. "So, will you help me, starting tomorrow, perhaps?" The sensible part of Fiona urged caution. She barely knew this man, despite his kindness. Yet something about Hayes' young inspired trust, and the practical reality was that she needed the money. "Yes," she decided, "I'll help you, but I have morning chores that can't wait." "I'm an early riser myself," Hayes assured her. "I'll come by after breakfast and we can begin our search." They spent the next hour discussing the surrounding properties, with Fiona marking locations on a rough map Hayes had brought. As the afternoon waned, he rose to leave. "Thank you for your time today, Miss Lawson. I look forward to our expedition tomorrow." At the door, he paused, his expression thoughtful. "May I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why do you stay here, enduring their contempt? You could start fresh somewhere else, somewhere people don't look down on you." The question struck at the heart of something Fiona rarely articulated, even to herself. "This land isn't just soil and trees," she said softly. "It holds my parents' dreams, their love, their final resting place. Leaving would feel like abandoning them." She met his gaze directly. "And I won't give those people the satisfaction of driving me away." Hayes studied her for a long moment, something like admiration kindling in his eyes. "Miss Lawson, I believe you may be the strongest person I've met in a very long time." With that, he tipped his hat and was gone, leaving Fiona standing in the doorway, wondering what tomorrow would bring and why this stranger's opinion mattered so much to her heart. The next morning, Fiona was up before dawn, moving through her chores with unusual energy. She milked the cows, fed the chickens, and collected eggs with time to spare. After a quick breakfast, she changed into her sturdiest dress and boots, then plaited her hair into a single braid. When Hayes arrived, he brought not only his chestnut gelding but also a gentle bay mare saddled and ready to ride. "For you," he explained, noting her surprised expression. "I borrowed her from the livery. I thought it would be easier than taking my horse double." Fiona approached the mare cautiously. "It's been a while since I've ridden anything but Old Penny, and she's hardly up for a day's journey anymore." "Maple here is steady as they come," Hayes assured her, offering a hand to help her mount. His touch was warm and firm as he assisted her into the saddle, lingering perhaps a moment longer than necessary. Fiona felt a rush of awareness at their proximity, but quickly focused on adjusting her skirts and taking up the reins. They rode north first, toward a parcel of land that had been abandoned the previous spring when the Hendersons gave up their struggle against the harsh Montana elements and returned east. The property boasted a reliable spring and good grazing land, sheltered from the worst of the winter winds. "The cabin's solid," Fiona explained as they dismounted to inspect the structure. "Mr. Henderson was a fine carpenter, but the land needs more hands than they had." Hayes nodded, eyes scanning the rolling meadows. "How many acres?" 160. They filed a homestead claim but never completed the requirements. He walked the perimeter of the property, asking intelligent questions about water sources, snow patterns, and neighboring ranches. Fiona was impressed by his thoroughness and practical knowledge. "You've done this before," she observed as they remounted. Hayes smiled. "I worked cattle in Texas, then Colorado, saved everything I earned until I could buy my own spread." A shadow crossed his face. Lost it all in '73 when the markets crashed, had to start over. Fiona was struck by this revelation. Yet here you are, ready to try again. Life has a way of knocking you down, he said, his expression resolute. The trick is getting back up one more time than you fall. They visited 2 more properties that day, stopping by a creek to eat the lunch Hayes had packed: fresh bread, cheese, apples, and even a small jar of honey. It was the finest meal Fiona had enjoyed in months. "Tell me about your parents," Hayes said as they sat in the dappled shade of cottonwood trees. "What brought them to Montana?" Fiona smiled at the memories his question evoked. "My father was a schoolteacher back in Illinois. My mother came from a farming family. They met when she was 19 and he came to teach at the local school." She traced patterns in the dirt with a twig. "They were so different. She was practical and earthy, he was full of books and dreams, but they balanced each other perfectly. And they came west for a new beginning." She nodded. "Father's lungs weren't good. The doctor suggested a drier climate. They sold everything and came here with almost nothing but hope." She looked across the rolling landscape. "They loved it here despite the hardships. Father would quote poetry about the mountains and skies. Mother would laugh and tell him pretty words wouldn't plant the corn, but you could see she loved his romantic nature. They sound like remarkable people." Hayes's voice was gentle. "They must have raised a remarkable daughter." Fiona felt heat rise to her cheeks at the compliment. "What about your family?" A flicker of something pain perhaps crossed Hayes's face before his expression smoothed. "Not much to tell. My mother died when I was young. My father wasn't exactly the nurturing type. I left home at 15 and made my own way." "I'm sorry," Fiona said, sensing there was much more to the story than he was sharing. Hayes shrugged. "It taught me self-reliance and the value of kindness." He began packing up their lunch things. "We should check that property near the fork in the river before heading back." As they continued their journey, Fiona found herself studying Hayes when he wasn't looking, the strong line of his jaw, the way his hands held the reins with confident ease, the occasional smile that transformed his serious face. She caught herself wondering what it would be like to be the focus of his attention for reasons beyond business. The thought startled her. It had been so long since she'd allowed herself to think of a man in such terms. After her parents died and the struggles began, most eligible men in town had quickly lost interest in the formerly prosperous Lawson girl. Those few who maintained their attentions had made it clear they saw her as desperate enough to accept propositions no respectable woman would consider. By the time they returned to her homestead late that afternoon, Fiona was tired but content in a way she hadn't felt in years. The day had been productive, the company pleasant, and for once the constant worry about survival had receded to the background. "Same time tomorrow?" Hayes asked as he helped her dismount, his hands at her waist sending a flutter through her stomach. "Yes, that would be fine," she replied, stepping back quickly to regain her composure. "Though I should warn you, there's a harvest festival in town tomorrow evening. People might talk if they see us riding together." Hayes's expression hardened slightly. "Let them talk. I've never put much stock in small-town gossip." "It's different for a woman alone," Fiona said quietly. "My reputation is all I have." Understanding softened his features. "Then we'll be careful, but I won't have you missing the festival on my account. In fact, I insist you attend as my guest if you'll do me the honor." Fiona stared at him in surprise. "You want me to accompany you to the festival?" "I do." His gaze was steady, challenging her to accept. "The same people who laughed at me yesterday will be there," she warned. Hayes smiled, a slow, determined curve of his lips. "All the more reason to go. I think it's time Cottonwood Creek revised its opinion of Fiona Lawson." Before she could formulate a response, he mounted his horse and tipped his hat. "Until tomorrow, Miss Lawson, I look forward to our continued partnership." As he rode away, Fiona stood frozen in place, her mind whirling with possibilities. The Harvest Festival had once been her favorite event of the year. Her parents had always made it special, her father playing fiddle for the dancing, her mother winning ribbons for her preserves. Since their deaths, she had avoided the celebration, unwilling to face the pity, or, worse, the satisfaction some took in her reduced circumstances. But the thought of attending with Hayes at her side filled her with a nervous excitement she hadn't felt in years. That night, she carefully washed her hair with the lavender soap Hayes had brought, then laid out the blue fabric he'd given her. It wasn't enough for a full dress, but perhaps she could fashion a new bodice to wear with her mother's black skirt. Working by candlelight, her fingers remembered skills long unused as she cut and stitched until well past midnight. Morning brought a light dusting of frost, and the realization that today might mark a turning point in her lonely existence. Whether for good or ill remained to be seen, but for the first time in 3 years, Fiona Lawson was looking forward rather than merely enduring. They spent the day visiting more properties, but Fiona found it difficult to focus, her thoughts repeatedly straying to the evening ahead. Hayes seemed to sense her distraction. "Second thoughts about the festival?" he asked as they watered their horses at a stream. Fiona shook her head. "Not second thoughts exactly, just wondering what people will say." Hayes's expression turned serious. "Fiona." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the sound of it in his deep voice sent a tremor through her. "I want to be clear about something. My interest in your company isn't charity or pity. I genuinely enjoy your presence and value your insights. Anyone who can't see your worth isn't worth your concern." His words warmed something long cold inside her. "Thank you," she said simply, unable to articulate the complex emotions his statement evoked. They returned earlier than the previous day to allow time for preparation. Hayes promised to return at sunset to escort her to town. Alone in her cabin, Fiona bathed as thoroughly as possible in the small tin tub, using precious heated water and the fragrant soap. She dressed with care in her mother's black skirt and the new blue bodice she'd created, which brought out the deep amber of her eyes. A touch of rosewater at her wrists and throat completed her modest toilette. When Hayes arrived, his appreciative gaze made all her efforts worthwhile. "Miss Lawson," he said, his voice low and warm, "you are a vision." She blushed, unused to such compliments. "It's just a simple outfit. It's not the clothes," he replied, offering his arm. "It's the woman wearing them." The Harvest Festival transformed the center of Cottonwood Creek. Lanterns hung from ropes stretched between buildings, casting a golden glow over the proceedings. Tables laden with food lined one side of the street, while an area had been cleared for dancing. A small band of local musicians played lively tunes, and the scent of roasted corn and apple cider filled the air. When Hayes and Fiona arrived, a noticeable hush fell over the nearest group of townsfolk. Whispers spread like ripples in a pond as heads turned in their direction. "Miss Lawson, what a surprise!" Mrs. Wilson from the boarding house approached first, her eyes darting curiously between Fiona and Hayes. "We haven't seen you at the festival these past few years." "Mr. Young persuaded me it was time to rejoin the celebration," Fiona replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "Indeed," Hayes added, his hand warm at the small of her back. "I couldn't imagine attending my first Cottonwood Creek festival without the company of someone who appreciates its traditions." Mrs. Wilson's expression betrayed her surprise at his evident regard for Fiona. "Well, you're both most welcome. The judging for preserves is about to begin, and there's plenty of cider." As they moved through the crowd, Fiona was acutely aware of the stares and whispers. Some greetings were genuinely warm from those like old Mr. Parker, who had always been kind, while others were stiff with shock or disapproval. "Fiona Lawson," Judith Mercer's voice cut through the pleasant hum of conversation. "How resourceful of you to find a new way to improve your situation." The implication was clear, and Fiona felt her face flame with humiliation. Before she could respond, Hayes stepped slightly forward. "Miss Mercer, isn't it?" His tone was polite but cold. "I've heard your father runs the general store." I'm in the market for substantial supplies as I establish my ranch. Perhaps you could tell him I'll be assessing the quality and fairness of local businesses before deciding where to spend my considerable budget." Judith's smug expression faltered. "I'm sure my father would be happy to discuss terms with you, Mr. Young." "Excellent," Hayes replied, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Though I place great value on how a business treats all its customers, not just those with the deepest pockets." "Character reveals itself in such details, wouldn't you agree?" Without waiting for a response, he guided Fiona toward the refreshment table. "Cider," he offered, as if the exchange had never happened. Fiona accepted the cup he handed her, studying his face. "That was the truth," he finished simply. "I don't do business with people who lack basic decency." As the evening progressed, Fiona gradually relaxed. Hayes introduced her to several cattlemen he'd met since arriving, speaking of her knowledge of the area with genuine respect. When the band struck up a waltz, he turned to her with a question in his eyes. "Would you do me the honor?" Fiona hesitated. She hadn't danced since before her parents' deaths. "I'm rather out of practice." "Fortunately, I'm an excellent lead," he replied with a smile that made refusal impossible. His hand at her waist was firm but gentle as he guided her into the dance. Despite her fears, her body remembered the steps, and soon they were moving in perfect harmony. For those moments, the stares and whispers faded away. There was only the music, the starlit sky above, and Hayes's steady gaze holding hers. "Thank you," she said softly as the music ended. "For what?" "For giving me back something I thought I'd lost." Understanding dawned in his eyes. "This is just the beginning, Fiona," he promised. "There's so much more waiting to be reclaimed." The words held a weight that sent her heart racing, but before she could respond, Sheriff Davis approached, his expression serious. "Young," he nodded curtly. "Miss Lawson, might I have a word with you, sir?" Hayes excused himself, stepping aside with the sheriff. Fiona couldn't hear their conversation, but the tension in Hayes's shoulders was evident. When he returned, his expression was carefully controlled. "Is everything all right?" she asked. "Just the sheriff being thorough about newcomers," Hayes replied, though something in his tone suggested there was more to it. "Nothing to worry about." The rest of the evening passed pleasantly enough, though Fiona noticed Hayes seemed preoccupied. As the festival wound down, he escorted her to where their horses waited. "I've enjoyed this evening immensely," he said as they rode slowly back to her homestead. "Your company makes even the most tedious social obligations a pleasure." "I hardly think you found it tedious," Fiona laughed. "Every unmarried woman in town was vying for your attention." "I only noticed one woman tonight," he replied, his voice low and serious. The simple declaration hung in the cool night air between them. When they reached her cabin, Hayes helped her dismount, his hands lingering at her waist. "Fiona," he began, then seemed to reconsider his words. "Thank you for accompanying me tonight." "Thank you for asking me," she replied, suddenly shy under his intense gaze. For a moment she thought he might kiss her, but instead he stepped back, ever the gentleman. "Good night, Fiona." "Sleep well." "Good night, Hayes." As she watched him ride away, Fiona wondered at the complex emotions stirring within her. It had been one thing to accept his business proposition and practical assistance, quite another to acknowledge the attraction growing between them. Hayes Young was quickly becoming more than a benefactor or employer. He was becoming someone she could care for deeply. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. Men like Hayes didn't stay in places like Cottonwood Creek for long. And when he left, would she be left more alone than before, having tasted a connection she'd never thought to find again? With these conflicting thoughts, she entered her cabin, carefully hanging up her festival clothes. Whatever tomorrow might bring, tonight had been magical, a brief respite from the struggles that had defined her life for too long. For now, that would have to be enough. The following week passed in a blur of activity. Each day, Hayes arrived at Fiona's homestead, and together they explored potential properties. Their conversations flowed easily, ranging from practical discussions about land management to personal philosophies and dreams for the future. With each passing day, Fiona found herself more drawn to Hayes's quiet strength and thoughtful manner. By Friday, Hayes had narrowed his search to 2 properties: the Henderson place and a larger parcel along the river that offered excellent water access but required significant investment to build adequate structures. "I'm leaning toward the river property," he confided as they shared lunch beneath a towering cottonwood. "The extra acreage would allow for expansion as the herd grows." "It's beautiful land," Fiona agreed, watching a hawk circle lazily overhead, "though the winters can be harsh near the water. Nothing proper shelters and windbreaks can't address." Hayes stretched his long legs before him, looking completely at ease in the wilderness. "I'm meeting with the bank on Monday to finalize the purchase." Something in his tone caught Fiona's attention. "You sound like you've made your decision." He nodded, his expression turning serious. "I have, which means our official business arrangement is coming to an end." "Oh," Fiona tried to hide her disappointment. These days with Hayes had been the brightest in her memory since her parents' deaths. The thought of returning to her solitary existence was more painful than she'd anticipated. "However," Hayes continued, his eyes intent on her face, "I have another proposition to discuss." Fiona's heart quickened. "What kind of proposition?" "The kind that requires careful consideration." He shifted to face her more directly. "Fiona, these past days have shown me that you possess exactly the knowledge and practical skills needed to help establish a successful ranch. Your understanding of this land, its seasons and challenges, is invaluable. Are you offering me a job?" She asked, both flattered and confused, in a manner of speaking. Hayes took a deep breath. "I'm proposing a partnership." Fiona stared at him. "A partnership, but I have nothing to contribute." "You have everything to contribute," he corrected firmly. "Knowledge, experience, determination. The kind of resilience that can't be bought." He paused, seemingly searching for the right words. "Your homestead is struggling, Fiona. We both know the challenges of trying to farm this land alone." The truth of his statement stung, but Fiona couldn't deny it. Despite her best efforts, she was barely surviving. "What exactly are you suggesting?" she asked cautiously. "Combine our resources. Your homestead adjoins the river property I'm considering. Together, they would make an impressive ranch. You would retain full ownership of your land, but we would operate as a single enterprise. Profits would be shared accordingly." The proposal was so unexpected that Fiona needed a moment to process it. "Why would you do this? You don't need my land or my help." Hayes's expression softened. "Maybe I don't need it, but I want it. I've worked alone most of my life, Fiona. I've learned the hard way that success means little without someone to share it with." The implication behind his words made her pulse quicken, but Fiona forced herself to think practically. People would talk. A single woman entering into business with a man she barely knows. "Let them talk," Hayes replied with a dismissive wave. "Or if you prefer, we could formalize the arrangement in other ways." "Other ways," Fiona echoed, her throat suddenly dry. Hayes met her gaze steadily. "I'm not a man who speaks without purpose, Fiona. Surely you've realized by now that my interest in you extends beyond business." The directness of his statement took her breath away. "Hayes, you don't need to answer now," he interrupted gently. "In fact, I'd prefer you didn't. This isn't a decision to make lightly, and I want you to be certain." He rose, offering his hand to help her up. "Take the weekend to consider both proposals, the business partnership and the possibility of something more personal between us." Fiona placed her hand in his, allowing him to pull her to her feet. They stood close, his warmth and scent leather, pine, and something uniquely Hayes enveloping her. "I'll come by on Monday morning," he said, his voice husky. "Whatever you decide, I'll respect it." The ride back to her homestead was quiet, both lost in their own thoughts. When they arrived, Hayes helped her dismount but didn't linger as he had on previous days. "Until Monday," he said simply, tipping his hat before riding away. Fiona spent the weekend in a state of emotional turmoil. Hayes's proposal, both the business partnership and the hint of deeper feelings, offered solutions to practical problems, and the promise of companionship she'd long denied herself. Yet caution warned her against trusting too quickly or completely. She walked her property, remembering her parents' dreams for this land. Would they approve of her joining forces with Hayes, or would they see it as surrendering their vision? "It's not surrender if it's freely chosen," she murmured to herself, touching the weathered post of the corral her father had built. "And it's not failure to admit you can't do everything alone." By Sunday evening, Fiona had made her decision. She slept fitfully, anticipation and anxiety battling in her dreams. When dawn broke, she was already awake, dressed in her best everyday dress, her hair neatly braided. Hayes arrived precisely at 8, his expression carefully neutral as he dismounted. "Good morning, Fiona." "Good morning, Hayes." She gestured toward the porch. "Would you like some coffee? Thank you." He followed her inside, removing his hat as he crossed the threshold. Fiona poured 2 cups and sat across from him at the small table. For a moment neither spoke, the only sound the ticking of the old clock on the mantel. "I've considered your proposals," Fiona finally said, her voice steadier than she expected. "Both of them." Hayes nodded, his eyes never leaving her face. "And the business partnership makes practical sense. You're right that my homestead is struggling, and combined with your resources and the river property, it could become something truly remarkable." She took a deep breath. "But there's a condition. Name it. I need to know why you're really here in Cottonwood Creek." Fiona met his gaze directly. "There are better cattle lands in Montana, more established towns. Yet you chose this place, and from the day you arrived, you've shown particular interest in me. I need to understand why." Hayes set down his coffee cup, his expression turning solemn. "You're right to ask, and you deserve the full truth." He seemed to gather his thoughts before continuing. "I came to Cottonwood Creek specifically looking for you, Fiona." The admission shocked her. "For me, but how did you even know I existed?" "Your father, Andrew Lawson, once taught at a small school in Illinois." Hayes's voice grew soft with memory. "There was a boy there, poor, dirty, often hungry, the son of the town drunk. Most teachers ignored him or worse, but your father saw something in that boy, treated him with dignity. Stayed after school to help him learn to read properly." Understanding dawned slowly. "That boy was you," Hayes nodded. "Your father changed the course of my life, Fiona. He told me education was my way out, that I could be more than my circumstances. When I left home at 15, it was his voice I heard pushing me to better myself, to read, to learn, to strive." Fiona's eyes filled with tears. "He never mentioned." "Why would he? It was simply who he was, a man who saw value where others saw nothing." Hayes reached across the table to take her hand. "Over the years, as I built my fortune, I tried to find him. I wanted to thank him, to show him that his faith hadn't been misplaced. When I finally located records of him moving to Montana territory, I followed the trail here." "Only to find he was gone," Fiona whispered. "Yes, but I found you instead." Hayes's grip tightened on her hand. "When I saw how the town treated you, heard the whispers and sneers, I recognized the same contempt I'd faced as a boy. But like your father, you stood tall despite it all, refusing to be broken. So your generosity was repayment for my father's kindness," Fiona concluded, a note of disappointment in her voice. "At first, perhaps," Hayes admitted. "But Fiona, what began as a debt of gratitude quickly became something else entirely. With each day in your company, I've grown to admire your strength, your intelligence, your gentle heart. My feelings for you have nothing to do with the past and everything to do with who you are." The sincerity in his eyes was unmistakable. Fiona felt tears spill onto her cheeks. "I wish he could have known what became of that boy he believed in." Hayes reached up to gently wipe away a tear with his thumb. "In a way, I think he does know. And I think he'd be proud of the daughter he raised to show the same compassion and fortitude." Fiona covered his hand with hers. "I accept your business proposal, Hayes, and..." She hesitated, gathering her courage. I'm open to exploring the possibility of something more between us. Relief and joy transformed Hayes's features. That's all I can ask for, a chance to prove my intentions are honorable and my feelings sincere. There will be challenges, Fiona warned. The town already talks. Let them, Hayes replied with newfound confidence. By this time next year, they'll be talking about the most successful ranch in the territory and the remarkable woman who helped build it. Next year, Fiona repeated, allowing herself to imagine such a future for the first time. It sounds like a dream. Not a dream, Hayes promised, raising her hand to his lips. A plan, and together we'll make it reality. The following months brought dramatic changes to Fiona's life. Hayes purchased the river property and immediately began improvements. True to his word, he treated their arrangement as a genuine partnership, valuing her input on everything from building designs to cattle breeds. As winter descended on Montana, Hayes moved into the foreman's cabin he'd built on the river property, close enough to assist with Fiona's homestead, but maintaining propriety in their living arrangements. They worked side by side through the snow and bitter cold, preparing for spring when the first cattle would arrive. The town's attitude gradually shifted as Hayes's investment brought new prosperity to Cottonwood Creek. The same merchants who had once sneered at Fiona now greeted her warmly, eager for the business the growing ranch provided. Even Judith Mercer managed stiff cordiality when Fiona and Hayes visited the general store. Remarkable how money changes people's perceptions, Hayes observed dryly as they loaded supplies into the wagon one December afternoon. It's not just the money, Fiona replied. It's seeing someone they dismissed as worthless succeed despite their predictions. Hayes loaded the last sack of flour and turned to her, his expression serious. You were never worthless, Fiona, not for a single moment. Their relationship had evolved with careful deliberation. Hayes was unfailingly respectful, never presuming upon their business arrangement to press for more intimacy than Fiona was ready to give. Their work together fostered a deep friendship built on mutual respect and growing affection. On Christmas Eve, Hayes invited Fiona to dinner at his cabin. She arrived to find the simple space transformed. A small pine tree decorated with paper stars and candles stood in one corner, a fire blazed in the hearth, and the table was set with Hayes's best dishes. "Merry Christmas, Fiona," he greeted her, taking her coat. "It's beautiful," she breathed, taking in the festive scene. "I haven't celebrated properly since." "I know," he said gently. "I thought it was time to reclaim another tradition." The meal was simple but delicious: roast venison, potatoes, fresh bread, and a pie Hayes admitted he'd purchased from Mrs. Wilson. Afterward, they sat before the fire, sharing stories of Christmases past. "I have something for you," Hayes said, retrieving a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with red ribbon. "Hayes, you shouldn't have," Fiona protested, though pleasure warmed her cheeks. "I have something for you as well, though it's not much." She handed him a carefully wrapped parcel. "Ladies first," he insisted, placing his gift in her hands. Fiona unwrapped it slowly, gasping when she revealed a small velvet box. Inside nestled a gold locket on a delicate chain. "It's exquisite," she whispered, touching it reverently. "Open it," Hayes urged softly. Inside was a tiny painted miniature of her parents, rendered with remarkable detail from the daguerreotype Fiona kept on her mantle. "How did you?" "I sent it to an artist in Denver," Hayes explained. "I wanted you to be able to keep them close always." Tears filled Fiona's eyes as she closed the locket carefully. "It's the most thoughtful gift I've ever received. Thank you." Hayes fastened the chain around her neck, his fingers warm against her skin. "Now mine," he said, taking the package she'd set aside. Fiona watched nervously as he unwrapped the hand-knit scarf she'd made during the long evenings alone. "It's not much compared to your gift." Hayes ran his fingers over the careful stitches. "You made this," she nodded, "during the evenings." I wanted you to have something warm for your morning rides. Fiona, he said, his voice thick with emotion, gifts made by hand with time and thought and care are beyond price. He wrapped the scarf around his neck. I'll treasure it always. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire's glow. Finally, Hayes turned to her, his expression earnest. These past months have been the happiest of my life, he said quietly. Working with you, building something meaningful together, it's everything I never knew I wanted. Fiona felt her heart quicken. For me as well. Hayes took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. I've been patient, Fiona, because I wanted to be certain of my feelings and yours. But I find myself increasingly unwilling to pretend my affections are merely those of a business partner or friend. Hayes, she began, but he gently placed a finger on her lips. Please, let me finish. I love you, Fiona Lawson. I love your strength and your gentleness, your practicality and your dreams. I love the way you hum when you work and the thoughtful furrow of your brow when you're solving a problem. His eyes held hers, vulnerable and hopeful. I don't expect an answer tonight. But I wanted you to know that whenever you're ready, if you ever feel the same, I'm here. And I'm not going anywhere. The declaration hung in the air between them, honest and unadorned. Fiona's heart pounded as she considered her response. The cautious part of her urged hesitation, but her heart recognized the truth in his words and in her own feelings. I don't need more time, she said softly. I've known for weeks now, perhaps months, that what I feel for you is far deeper than friendship or gratitude. She met his gaze directly. I love you too, Hayes. I think perhaps I began falling the moment you stood up for me in town, when no one else would. The joy that transformed Hayes's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Slowly, giving her every chance to withdraw, he leaned forward. Their lips met in a tender, questioning kiss that quickly deepened with shared emotion. When they finally parted, Hayes rested his forehead against hers. I want to do this properly, Fiona. Court you as you deserve, with the respect and honor befitting the woman I hope to make my wife. Wife. Fiona echoed, scarcely believing what she was hearing. Hayes smiled, kissing her again briefly. Not tonight, not tomorrow, but someday when we've had time to be certain, when the ranch is established, when you're ready, I want nothing more than to make our partnership permanent in every way. Fiona felt tears of happiness spill onto her cheeks. I never thought to find such joy again after my parents died. I believed that part of my life was over. Not over, Hayes promised, wiping away her tears. Just waiting for the right moment to begin anew. As the fire crackled and snow fell softly outside, Fiona Lawson, once pitied and scorned by her neighbors, found herself enveloped in a love she had never dared to hope for. The girl who had nothing now possessed the greatest treasure of all, a future bright with promise and a heart overflowing with joy. Spring arrived with its promise of renewal, transforming the Montana landscape with fresh green grass and wildflowers. The ranch Hayes and Fiona had envisioned began to take shape, as the first cattle arrived, 100 head of sturdy Herefords better suited to the northern climate than the Texas Longhorns many ranchers preferred. True to his word, Hayes courted Fiona with patient devotion. They maintained separate residences, but their days were spent in constant companionship as they worked to establish what they now called the Sunrise Ranch, named for the spectacular view of dawn breaking over the eastern ridge. By May, word of their success had spread, bringing an unexpected visitor to their door. James Baldwin, editor of the Montana Stockman, arrived unannounced one afternoon as Fiona and Hayes were repairing a section of fence. "Mr. Young, Miss Lawson," he called, approaching on horseback. "I'd like a word, if you please," Hayes straightened, wiping his brow. "Mr. Baldwin, what brings you out this way?" "Stories of the most ambitious new ranch in the territory," the editor replied, dismounting. "They say you've brought in eastern breeding stock, implemented the latest fencing techniques, even hired a veterinarian from Chicago." "News travels fast," Hayes observed with a smile. "But yes, we've made some investments we believe will pay dividends in the long run." Baldwin's gaze shifted between Hayes and Fiona, curiosity evident. And this partnership arrangement, it's rather unusual, isn't it? A single lady and a bachelor running a ranch together. Fiona felt her cheeks warm but met the editor's gaze steadily. The arrangement has proven beneficial for both parties, Mr. Baldwin. My knowledge of local conditions complements Mr. Young's business acumen and resources. Indeed, Baldwin nodded, scribbling in his notebook, and the town's reaction, I understand there was some resistance initially. Hayes stepped slightly closer to Fiona, his protective instinct evident. Perspectives change when results speak for themselves. We've brought substantial business to Cottonwood Creek. Most folks have come to appreciate that. The interview continued for nearly an hour as Baldwin toured the property, clearly impressed by the operation they'd established in such a short time. When he finally departed, promising a feature in the next edition of The Stockman, Fiona and Hayes shared a look of amusement. "Fame finds us," Hayes chuckled, resuming his work on the fence. "Is that what you wanted when you came here?" Fiona asked. "Recognition?" Hayes considered the question seriously. "No," he finally replied. "What I wanted was to build something meaningful, to honor your father's memory by helping his daughter, to prove that a boy from nothing could become a man of substance." He glanced at her, his expression softening. "What I found was so much more." The article appeared 2 weeks later, portraying the Sunrise Ranch as a model of innovation and Hayes and Fiona as visionary partners transforming cattle ranching in Montana. Copies circulated quickly through Cottonwood Creek, changing perceptions almost overnight. Suddenly, Fiona found herself greeted with respect when she went to town. The same women who had once whispered behind their hands now invited her to join their sewing circle. Men tipped their hats with genuine deference rather than mocking politeness. Strange how a newspaper article can accomplish what years of honest living couldn't, Fiona remarked one evening as she and Hayes sat on her porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in spectacular hues. "People respect success," Hayes replied, his arm comfortably around her shoulders. "It's not admirable, but it's human nature. And if we had failed," Hayes kissed her temple gently, "then we would have failed together with our dignity intact, and that would have been enough." The simple certainty in his voice confirmed what Fiona had come to know over the past months. Hayes Young was a rare man who measured worth by character rather than circumstance, who saw value where others saw only deficit. As summer progressed, their relationship deepened alongside their business success. They worked hard during daylight hours, building fences, monitoring the herd, hiring and training hands. In the evenings, they often shared quiet meals, talking of the day's events and their hopes for the future. By August, when the haying was done and the first calves were growing strong, Hayes began construction on a new house larger than his cabin but not ostentatious, positioned on a rise overlooking both properties. "It seems extravagant for one person," Fiona observed as they reviewed the plans one evening. "I'm not building it for one person," Hayes replied, his meaning clear in the warm intensity of his gaze. The statement hung between them, full of promise. They had spoken of marriage as an eventual goal, but Hayes had been careful not to press, giving Fiona time to be absolutely certain of her feelings. That night, as he walked her home beneath a sky brilliant with stars, Fiona made her decision. When they reached her porch, instead of saying goodnight as usual, she took his hand. "Hayes," she said softly, "I don't need more time." He studied her face in the moonlight, understanding dawning in his eyes. "You're sure?" "More sure than I've ever been about anything," she affirmed. "I love you, Hayes Young. I want to build this life with you not just as business partners, but as husband and wife." The joy that illuminated his features was answer enough, but he gathered her into his arms, his kiss conveying everything words could not. When they finally parted, both breathless, Hayes pressed his forehead to hers. "I should do this properly," he murmured. "Get down on one knee, have a ring ready." Fiona laughed softly. "When have we ever done things the conventional way?" Hayes smiled against her lips. Fair point. He took her hands in his expression turning serious. Fiona Lawson, will you marry me? Will you be my wife, my partner in all things, the mother of my children, the keeper of my heart? Yes, she answered simply. With all that I am, yes. They married on a perfect September day, with the mountains blazing in autumn colors and the ranch hands serving as witnesses. Reverend Collins from Cottonwood Creek performed the ceremony on the knoll where their new home was taking shape, the half-built structure symbolizing the life they were creating together. Fiona wore a dress of cream-colored silk that Hayes had ordered from Denver, with her mother's lace veil and the locket containing her parents' portraits close to her heart. Hayes stood tall in a new suit, Fiona's hand-knit scarf tucked in his pocket as a talisman of her love. I, Hayes, take you, Fiona, to be my lawfully wedded wife, he vowed, his voice steady with certainty. I promise to cherish you in plenty and in want, in joy and in sorrow, in sickness and in health, as long as we both shall live. Fiona's voice trembled slightly as she repeated her own vows, overwhelmed by the journey that had brought her from desolation to this moment of perfect happiness. By the power vested in me, Reverend Collins proclaimed, I now pronounce you husband and wife. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder. The small gathering erupted in cheers as Hayes swept Fiona into a kiss that sealed their union and promised a lifetime of devotion. The celebration afterward was simple but joyous. Tables were set up near the construction site, laden with food prepared by Mrs. Wilson and the other women who had finally accepted Fiona as one of their own. Lanterns hung from the exposed beams of the new house, creating a magical atmosphere as dusk fell. Even Judith Mercer attended, offering stilted congratulations and a gift of fine linens. Fiona accepted both with gracious warmth, refusing to harbor resentment on this day of new beginnings. As the evening progressed, Hayes led Fiona away from the festivities to a quiet spot overlooking the valley. The first stars were appearing in the deepening blue of the sky, and a nearly full moon cast silver light over the land that was now truly theirs. Happy, Mrs. Young? He asked, his arms encircling her from behind. More than I ever imagined possible, Fiona answered, leaning into his embrace. Sometimes I wonder if I'm dreaming. Hayes turned her in his arms, his expression serious in the moonlight. If this is a dream, then we're dreaming it together. And I never want to wake up. Nor I, Fiona agreed, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. This is the life I choose, Hayes, with you for all our days. Later that night, as they lay entwined in the privacy of Hayes's cabin, now their shared home, until the new house was completed, Fiona reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment of complete fulfillment. What are you thinking? Hayes murmured, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. About the day we met, she replied. How I was so humiliated by those broken eggs, and you turned everything around with a simple act of kindness. Hayes propped himself on one elbow, gazing down at her with tender affection. It wasn't simple at all. It was the most important decision of my life to speak up, to stand beside you, to promise that everything you wanted I would get. And you have, Fiona marveled, everything I truly needed and so much more. I'm just getting started, he promised, gathering her close. We have a lifetime ahead of us, Fiona Young, a lifetime to build our dreams together. As autumn gave way to winter, the new house was completed just before the first heavy snowfall. Hayes carried Fiona across the threshold on a bright December morning, both of them laughing as Ranger. The border collie pup Hayes had given Fiona as a wedding gift, bounded in after them, eager to explore. Welcome home, my love, Hayes said, setting her gently on her feet in the spacious main room where a fire already blazed in the hearth. Fiona turned slowly, taking in the details Hayes had incorporated to surprise her built-in bookshelves for her father's treasured volumes. A bay window overlooking her mother's garden plot, now dormant under snow but ready for spring planting. It's perfect, she whispered, tears of happiness welling in her eyes. You've thought of everything? Not quite everything, Hayes replied with a mysterious smile. There's one more surprise upstairs. He led her to a small room adjacent to their bedroom. The door was closed and Hayes paused with his hand on the knob. This room is for our future, he said softly. For the family I hope we'll build together. Inside was a nursery, simply but beautifully furnished with a hand-carved cradle, a rocking chair by the window, and walls painted a soft yellow that reminded Fiona of early spring sunshine. Hayes, she breathed, touching the smooth wood of the cradle. How did you manage this without my knowing? I have my ways, he replied, watching her reaction carefully. Is it too presumptuous? I know we haven't discussed timing, but I wanted you to know how much I long for our children when you're ready. Fiona turned to him, her heart so full she could scarcely speak. It's not presumptuous at all, in fact. She took his hand and placed it gently on her abdomen. I was waiting for the right moment to tell you. I suspected last month, but I wanted to be certain. Hayes stared at her, comprehension dawning slowly. Fiona, are you saying? She nodded, her smile radiant. By midsummer, this cradle won't be empty. With a cry of joy, Hayes lifted her into his arms, spinning her in a circle before setting her down quickly. Careful, I shouldn't. Is that safe? Are you well? Do you need to rest? Fiona laughed at his sudden concern. I'm perfectly fine, Hayes. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I'm healthy and strong. Hayes knelt before her, his hands gently cradling her still flat stomach. A baby, he whispered in wonder. Our child. Fiona, you've given me more happiness than I ever dreamed possible. We've given each other a second chance, she corrected softly, running her fingers through his hair. A new beginning neither of us expected. That winter was the happiest of Fiona's life. The ranch thrived despite the harsh weather, with Hayes's careful planning ensuring ample hay and shelter for the cattle. Their home became a sanctuary of warmth and love, a stark contrast to the lonely cabin Fiona had inhabited for so long. As her body changed with the growing life within, Hayes treated her with reverent care, insisting she rest while taking on more of the household duties himself. He read to her in the evenings by the fire, books of poetry her father had loved, his deep voice soothing as the winter winds howled outside. Spring's arrival coincided with the first definitive movements of their child, tiny flutterings that grew to distinct kicks and turns. Hayes spent hours with his head in Fiona's lap, his hand on her rounded belly, marveling at each movement. He's going to be strong like his mother, Hayes predicted one evening as a particularly energetic kick made Fiona wince. Or she will take after her father's determination, Fiona countered with a smile. Either way, this child will be loved beyond measure. The community that had once ostracized Fiona now embraced the expectant mother, bringing gifts and offering advice. Mrs. Wilson organized a gathering of women to sew baby clothes and blankets. Even Judith Mercer contributed a beautifully embroidered christening gown, a piece offering that Fiona accepted with genuine gratitude. As summer approached, Fiona's time grew near. Dr. Peterson, the physician Hayes had convinced to relocate to Cottonwood Creek, visited regularly to ensure mother and child were healthy. Everything looks excellent, Mrs. Young, he assured them during his final visit before the birth. You're as strong as any woman I've attended, and the baby is positioned perfectly. Despite these reassurances, Hayes grew increasingly anxious as the expected date approached. He hired additional hands to manage the ranch work, refusing to be far from Fiona's side. His concern both touched and amused her. Hayes, women have been doing this since Eve, she reminded him gently. I'll be fine. I know, he acknowledged, kissing her hand. But you are my heart, Fiona, the thought of you in pain. Pain with purpose, she corrected. Pain that brings new life. There's beauty in that, don't you think? In the end, their daughter arrived with surprising speed one perfect July morning. Fiona woke Hayes before dawn, her contractions already regular and strong. By mid-morning, as sunlight streamed through the bedroom windows, Eleanor Faith Young announced her presence with lusty cries that brought tears to her father's eyes. "She's perfect," Hayes whispered, holding his daughter for the first time. "Look what we created, Fiona." Exhausted but radiant, Fiona watched the man who had changed her life cradle their child with hands that trembled slightly from emotion. In that moment, the circle of love that had begun with her parents continued through Hayes's connection to her father and now extended to this new generation felt complete. "We'll call her Ellie," Fiona decided. "A bright light for our future." "Ellie Young," Hayes agreed, sitting carefully beside Fiona on the bed so they could admire their daughter together. "Welcome to the world, little one. You are so very loved." As summer faded into autumn once more, marking a year since Hayes had first arrived in Cottonwood Creek, Fiona often reflected on the extraordinary transformation of her life. From a woman laughed at for having nothing, she had become the respected Mrs. Young, co-owner of the most promising ranch in the territory, mother to a beautiful daughter, and wife to a man whose love seemed to deepen with each passing day. On the anniversary of their first meeting, Hayes surprised Fiona with a special dinner after Ellie had been put to bed. By firelight, they shared memories of that fateful encounter outside the livery. "You remember what I promised that day?" Hayes asked, refilling their glasses with wine from a bottle he'd saved for the occasion. "How could I forget?" Fiona smiled. "Everything she wants, I'll get." "Rather bold of you, Mr. Young, but accurate, I hope." His eyes searched hers. Suddenly serious, Fiona reached across the table to take his hand. "Beyond accurate, Hayes. You've given me everything I ever wanted and so much I never dared to dream of." Hayes raised her hand to his lips. "And you, Fiona Young, have made me the wealthiest man in Montana, not in gold or acres, but in love and purpose." Outside their window, the first snowflakes of winter began to fall, promising another season of quiet evenings by the fire with Ellie growing stronger each day. Inside, warmed by love and secure in their shared future, Fiona and Hayes Young welcomed the changing season, certain that whatever challenges might come, they would face them together, partners in all things forever. The woman who once had nothing now possessed everything that truly mattered: a loving husband, a beautiful child, a prosperous future, and the knowledge that she had earned every blessing through her own strength and resilience. And Hayes, the boy who had been seen as worthless, had found his true value in loving and being loved by Fiona. As they stood together at the window, watching the snow transform their land into a glistening wonderland, Hayes wrapped his arms around his wife from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Happy?" he asked softly. Fiona leaned back against his solid strength, contentment filling her completely. "Perfectly," she whispered. "Absolutely perfectly happy." And in that moment, in that house built with love on land reclaimed through determination, surrounded by the life they had created together, they both knew this happiness was not merely a fleeting emotion, but the foundation of all their tomorrows, endless and enduring, like the Montana sky above their home.